Hi, and welcome back to the MilVet podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Aronson, and today I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Jim Lose. Jim is the OG of veteran recruiting. He spent nearly 25 years in the space, and he recently joined TMV as our COO. I cannot say enough good things about Jim. If you're interested in how to get a job, we're planning to get a bit tactical in today's episode. There are few people on the entire planet who are as well suited to have this conversation as Jim. He's put nearly 3,000 veterans into jobs over the last 25 years. And Jim, I think we estimated that you've talked to 1.5% of all U.S. veterans over the last couple decades. Is that accurate?
If you say so, but it's been more than about 150,000 conversations during this time. So yes.
Okay, it's like a wild number. Before we dive in, I'd like to invite you to subscribe, share the podcast with a friend. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my sincere pleasure, Brendan. Thanks for hosting and also just for being an awesome teammate, creating a fabulous company where we have community, content, and careers for the veterans who we're helping out.
Yeah, it is a pleasure. And before this turns into a meeting of the Mutual Admiration Society, let's dive into it. Sorry if today's episode, hopefully it's going to be fun. It's going to be engaging. We're going to laugh quite a bit. Jim is a great colleague and we have a lot of fun. And it's a little bit surreal to be recording this episode together, I feel, at least on my end, because for backstory, Jim's going to tell you about his background in a second. But we began the conversation at the beginning of the year and we're trying to figure out how we could work together over the course of the first half of the year, and finally we're able to do so. It's just funny to see it come full circle. So if you hear us laughing and giggling like schoolgirls, I apologize. But Jim, I've given a 30,000 foot overview of your background. It's always great to hear it in the first person. Can you take a few minutes to tell us about yourself?
Sure, happy to. My journey begins in Pennsylvania, where I grew up. I went to college. And in school, I wanted to serve. I knew I did. I just didn't know exactly how to do it. I went to a recruiter's office, no joke, thinking about options and enlisting and that. And then I luckily bumped into a friend who had just signed up for the Marine Corps PLC. So I checked out the services in the Marine Corps. The OSO, Officer Selection Officer, gave me the soft sell, just said, look, here's the program. It's hard as all. And then if you're interested, call me. And that was it. So I was in. And so commissioned as a second lieutenant upon graduation, served 8 years in the Marines. I was an intelligence officer on the ground side. Was with 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines for my first 3.5 years. Scout Sniper Platoon Commander, your typical kind of JO sort of jobs. I was a company commander at 7th Marines for about 8 months before doing my B-billet in the Pentagon with the National Intelligence Support Teams, which was fabulous. It's what I joined to do. It was working at the top levels of the intelligence community and deploying out of the Pentagon anytime there was a crisis in the world. Our teams were sent to set up a link between the Pentagon and the troops in the field. So it was a ton of fun. But at the end of it, I knew I was a citizen soldier. I did not plan to stay for a career. Stayed for 8 years because it was just awesome. But I wanted to get on with my life and figure out from there what I wanted to do. And I knew I wasn't going to stay in defense or intelligence. Just wanted to break free and do something in business. And didn't have a lot of guidance, quite honestly. My parents, neither of them were in business. Talked with some friends who had gotten out, and that's where I learned about military recruiting and then the Lucas Group. So contacted Lucas Group, which at the time, they're really the folks who pioneered the entire industry, Art Lucas. They were in business for 50 years. I joined about the 30-year mark in 2000. And then while I was at Lucas, worked on the candidate recruiting side for the entire time there. But after about 7-8 years, moved into a team leadership role, then became a managing partner, oversaw recruiting for the East Coast, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic regions. And then around 2021, we were acquired by Korn Ferry. So pivoted to Korn Ferry, was a principal there for the last 2.5 years before you recruited me to join the military veteran. So that's my story.
That's awesome. A couple quick fun facts about Jim. He studied a bit of Russian in undergrad. He's a Russian history buff, which is super cool. I can't even spell the word Russia, but Jim, it's like a hobby or passion. It's an area of interest. So that's super cool. And I guess you had told me on the phone the other day that was like in order to prep yourself for a career in Intel, which I think is really interesting.
Thought it was a possible path to get into intelligence. Studied over in Volgograd when it was the Soviet Union, believe it or not. That kind of dates myself. But awesome experience. And for whatever reason, the Marine Corps did think that made me qualified to be an intelligence officer. So it did pan out.
That's awesome. The other fun fact about Jim, he's the only person I've ever met who has something positive to say about serving in the Pentagon as a captain. That's like truly unique, Jim.
I showed up as a first lieutenant, believe it or not. I checked out on the directory of the Pentagon. I was the only Marine Corps first lieutenant in the entire building. But yeah, I know a lot of people feel like it's the staff job from hell, but like anything in life, it's what you make of it. And for me, working with the CIA, DIA, NSA, all overtly, the program, and then having that kind of, it was heady stuff, like being as a 25, 26-year-old, like being in the tank when they're briefing the president and stuff like that. It was awesome. Yeah.
That's super cool. That is awesome. That's great. I've actually never set foot in the Pentagon, which is not something I'm actively trying to rectify. It does sound like you had one of the cool jobs there. Jim, I want to cut straight into it and ask you, so you found yourself in this recruiting role. Why'd you stick around? It sounds like you didn't have a ton of different things on your radar necessarily when you were transitioning. You wound up in this seat, but it ended up being a remarkable fit for you. Why'd you stick around? What'd you like about it? What keeps you motivated and in the job and enjoying it?
I guess initially I got into it because, like, leaving active duty, I was thinking about being a school teacher. I grew up in a family where service was like, my mom was a teacher, my dad was a minister, big church in a small town, the leader in the community. And so I knew it was just ingrained in me. I was going to give back somehow. And then I heard about military recruiting and I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I could help vets get jobs and that sort of thing, not knowing anything about the industry or that it was even sales, so to speak. But that was it. And I got into it. I thought maybe this could be something I'm good at. And I loved it. I loved the conversations. I loved my candidates and still do. They're awesome. And I really enjoy exposing folks like who I was, leaving active duty, not having a lot of sense of what's out there, to careers that people have never thought of before. They head into them, and many of them 15, 20 years later, they're running the companies where I placed them.
Yeah, it's super gratifying to see people thrive in these roles when you put them into them. It really is awesome. More generally speaking, you mentioned that recruiting is a sales role. I would go like even a little bit further and say almost not every role in business is a sales role, but sales is really core to almost every business function. But I want to ask, what are the elements of sales that you enjoy? What are the and what types of folks really excel in recruiting as a career? Because it's not a career path that was ever on my radar personally. And now that I'm in the field and see what it's like, it's a ton of fun. I love it. So I'm just curious, what elements of sales do you enjoy? And then what types of folks really excel or enjoy this type of career?
At first, when I was talking with my recruiter at Lucas Group, Mike Christ, who I worked side by side with for 20 years, I told him anything but sales, not for me. Really not having an idea of what sales was. It's the cars, it's Amway, all this sort of stuff. But I had no idea what business to business sales was all about. And then there was a consumer element in the sense our candidates have buying decisions and have free will to make the decision whether or not they want to accept an offer and that sort of thing. It's a form of sales for sure, and there's an absolute sales element to recruiting. I just didn't really look at it that way when I was getting into it. Again, it was that kind of little bit of altruistic outlook that I had. But from the standpoint, when I look back, I sold door to door as a little kid at a Boys Life magazine when I was a Cub Scout, stationery, wrapping paper, and stuff like that. Like, I was born to sell. I just didn't really know it at the time. And I think a lot of people don't know it at the time when they're leaving active duty. It's almost like a dirty word. But really, for somebody who's going to get into either sales and specifically this career, it's all relationships. It's relationship building, relationship management, and an entrepreneurial spirit. In recruiting, your desk is your company almost. It is your business. So what you make of that business is 100% up to you. You put a lot into it, get a lot out of it. Like anything, you can let it go stagnant and have a pretty cold desk. But yeah, entrepreneurial spirit's critical.
For sure. Yeah. I feel like it teaches a lot of good life lessons, right? It's like you can always, like, one of the biggest takeaways I feel like I've had from being an entrepreneur, from being in a sales role, is that you measure and try and evaluate your own yourself and how much fulfillment that you're getting based on the inputs that you're putting in, understanding that the outputs oftentimes have other people get a say, right? It's like saying the enemy gets a say. So I feel like that's one, and then the value of just like tenacity.
Definitely.
You got to be like locked in. You got to be disciplined about it. You're constantly generating new leads. These kinds of life lessons, they're critical and super helpful.
Yeah, and then and having a competitive spirit. I grew up playing sports, was on championship teams, in the Marine Corps, competed against my peer group, that sort of thing. But it wasn't until I joined Lucas that I realized just how competitive I was. And every week the scoreboard, the sales chart is up there, and you want to be at the top. At least I did.
Totally. Yeah, 100%. Jim, you've helped a bunch of folks transition into new careers. I want to ask you, what are some of the most significant challenges that veterans face when they're transitioning to civilian careers? There's a lot of them, but maybe based on the folks that you've talked to over the decades, I would be curious to hear, what are some of the most significant challenges that you see our community face when they transition?
A little bit depends on the economy. Certainly in a down economy, when people were getting out in 2009, 2010, challenges were absolutely the job market. But overarching, the biggest challenge that has is just moving beyond, shifting their sense of self and their identity. In the Marines, I'm sure, Brendan, it was the same for you. Like, I'm a Marine. When you introduce yourself or people ask you what you do, it's, I'm a Marine.
Totally.
When you take off the uniform, it can be hard to find your footing, especially in communities that are super close knit. I know the soft world, which I was not, but that's one where it's so close, the work that they do. And when they leave those teams, they can leave their identity behind too. And so my advice for people is find your people wherever you are, whether it's in a big company. I talked with a former Army major who had gotten out. He joined one of the defense primes. And after about 9 months was calling and just saying, man, I just am not finding my footing. And I encouraged him, stick it out, man. Dig in, find vets in the company. There will be there. Veterans want to help veterans is what I found. So find your people where you are, and then also dig into the local community. Affect what you can affect. And what you can affect is very localized when you're first transitioning out, whether it's your church, whether you're coaching, like whatever it is. That will bring satisfaction and help you create a new identity.
Totally. Yeah, it is really critical because in the military, your community and your tribe is teed up for you. It's your platoon, it's the people that you're around all day, every day, and they have this they've got a shared identity, they've got these shared goals, and that goes away when you get out. So it is really tricky, and it's so important to find that tribe. It's so critically important, which is why I feel like I always recommend to folks when they're thinking about what they want to do after the military or thinking about the next step in their career, I do encourage folks to really think about the team culture and the team that they're going to be joining first and foremost,
Definitely.
right? Because you're going to become more like the people that you spend a lot of time with. And so I want to be around and spending time with people who I admire and who I respect and who I want to be more like, because I will become more like them. But curious.
100%.
Cool. Curious to hear, just like general, if you were transitioning out of the military and you were beginning a job hunt today, what are the top pieces of advice that you would have for beginning that job hunt, like starting from scratch? What action should people be taking? What should they be doing as they are beginning to kick off a job hunt?
So first, I would roll it back about 12 months and just tell the person, get your financial house in order early. Have options. Ultimately, if you have your finances, you have savings in place, it gives you some breathing room when you're getting out, so that when the paycheck from the government ends, you don't feel like your back is up against the wall. So, if you're able to do that early, it will buy you time and give you more flexibility. If you're starting today, first and foremost, get your financial house in order early. And then if you're starting the career search today, keep an open mind would be my first piece of advice. Have conversations. Even if you're not 100% it's for you, you won't be. If there's a 70% interest level, engage, interview, that sort of thing. But keep an open mind. The team, the culture you're joining, as you said, Brendan, that's what I would hone in on. Because ultimately, people quit their boss. People quit the team, generally speaking. Most people who are moving from one career to another, it's not for money most of the time, at least who I'm working with. It's values. So advice I'd give, get your financial house in order early. keep an open mind to your options. There's a ton out there, especially as you're entering the workforce for the first time. You don't necessarily know everything that's there. You may know where your friends went to work, what your parents do, but there's a whole world out there. And then certainly as you start the interview process, focus on the culture, focus on the team, because they'll be what keep you there. They'll keep you engaged and keep you from leaving.
Yeah, this is really good advice. I want to also ask about mistakes that folks might make when they're transitioning out and when they're beginning a job search for the first time. What are some of the common mistakes that you've seen candidates that you've worked with over the years make? It could be mistakes that they make in the interviews, in prepping themselves ahead of time, in their resumes, in networking, in intel gathering, right? There's a lot of different variables, but what are some of the mistakes that you've seen candidates make as they kick off their job search?
Believe it or not, the biggest one is building or buying a house before you have a job. Because ultimately, depending on what's going on in the market where you're buying, we've just retired. I'm on the eastern shore of North Carolina. It really limits what options are there on the eastern shore of North Carolina. So if there are not awesome careers, it may be difficult to pay for the brand new house that you're building. So that's the big one. There will always be a house to move into, but I'd say wait till you find your employment before doing so. Beyond that, as far as the interviews go, the big thing really is just know that they're evaluating you and you are evaluating them too. But keep your game face on a little bit and keep focused when you're in the interviews. I can't tell you how far people have gone in an interview process and didn't just trip up with just what I would say are things that maybe they would never have done, but nervousness or insecurity about the search. We are catching, Brendan, if it's a transitioning vet, this individual may have been kicking in doors and truly taking the fight to the enemy in situations that are unbelievably challenging, but we're catching them at their most insecure time as they make this move, as they think about financial security and insecurity, as how am I going to take care of my family and all of this. And people get nervous. And when you're nervous, you can do some stuff that you ordinarily would never do.
For sure. Can I tell you a quick story?
Would love to hear it.
Okay. I went to the Service Academy Career Conference a few years ago, which I haven't been back in probably 3 years, but I went and I've never seen so many high performing people with such sweaty palms in my entire life. There's dudes telling me these crazy stories about landing on the backs of aircraft carriers that are pitching and rolling in the sea at night. And then people on these wild raids against the Taliban. But you put them in front of an interviewer or a company that they might be interested in, and they freeze up, they lock up, they're super, super nervous. And it's not shocking because it's a different situation. And there's other high stakes environments they've prepped for them. So how do you recommend people control some of their nervousness if they are getting in front of an employer for the first time? And any kind of tips that you might have for just being calm, cool, collected under fire in an interview?
Definitely. It's like anything in the military. Rehearsals are the key to success. Prepare, practice, go over your questions, give them to a buddy, give them to your spouse, have them grill you on camera. Hear how you sound, see the camera doesn't lie, see how you look. Video interviewing is a huge part of the world today. Everybody does it, so you got to be prepared for that. But over prepare, because giving a brief or anything, if you know your material, and you're going to just come across a lot more confident, and confidence is going to win the day. And there is a fine line between confidence and arrogance, which is probably the biggest turnoff in an interview that I've heard. But confidence is critical, and that's who the employers are looking for.
For sure. And ultimately, they're quizzing you on something that you are a true subject matter expert on 99% of the time. If it's a case study or something like that, and it's okay, you might not know some of the material, but if it's a behavioral interview, nobody knows your story as well as your story. You are literally the world's foremost expert on it.
Definitely. And you're making a point as far as the story piece. The interviewing is the art of storytelling, and it's succinct illustrations that relate to the question that you're asked and drive your points home. And by now, I would imagine the listeners are familiar with the STAR format for responding to questions, but it keeps it real tight. Situation, task, action, results for answering any question that you're given. You're in, you're out, you've given a full response and an example of a time where you were successful, albeit in the military, but relating it back to the civilian work that you're interviewing for.
Yeah, that star format is super helpful. I always also recommend for folks heading into interviews to make a list of stories. When I was interviewing for MBA programs, do behavioral interviews as well, right? Just like a job. And so I had this list of stories, and I had my Gunny Abadi story in my hip pocket. And I knew that story was about a time that I had to work with a teammate who was a bit challenging. He's a wonderful American. Can't say enough good things about Gunny Abadi, but he could be challenging to work with sometimes. And then I had the star format for that story, so I could tell it, and from start to finish, I rehearsed it, of course, and then I made index cards for questions that might then relate to that specific story. And I felt like that was a really good framework for prepping for interviews.
The flashcards are golden. They're so old school. I love them. But question on one side and then just talking points on the other side. You can hand them to a buddy who's going through the same thing, your spouse. But the beauty of the flashcard is just by the fact of making them, writing them down in an interview, you will see your bullets and everything in your mind's eye. And it just keeps it so simplistic and on point.
Yeah. The only downside to the flashcards is, of course, you do have to be able to read and write. So for any of our fellow Marines in the audience, good luck with that.
Crayons have worked pretty well from what I
And they make for a great snack as well. Okay, I've got some tips to share as well. I always recommend for folks to smile, sit up straight before the interview. It sounds like really dumb advice. I feel stupid giving this advice. I give it all the time, but I think it goes a really long way. Essentially, people are going to mirror or feed off of the energy that you give them. So it's almost impossible to be in a bad mood when someone's around you and they're smiling and they're excited to be talking to you and they're engaging. And for some people, that's not as natural. And I encourage those folks to almost think of themselves as an actor. And of course, you want to be authentic in an interview. You want to bring your authentic self, because if you're trying to be someone that you're not, it's not going to be a good fit. They're going to be hiring the wrong person because they're hiring who they think you are. But I heard this story about Beyonce when she performs on stage, and I can't even imagine how nervous you would get if you were performing in front of like hundreds of thousands of people. I know you're a Taylor Swift fan, Jim. I'm assuming that this applies to Taylor Swift as well. But yeah, she puts on this persona when she's on stage of who she wants to be on stage, and that makes it easier for her to then fall into that character. And I think that's good advice for the interview too, is maybe I'm just going to act like someone who is very confident in their story and someone who's excited to be on this call, and then it'll become very natural over the course of the conversation. It sounds like dumb advice, but I always do recommend that to folks.
It's 100%. You have to be yourself. But in the interview, you want to be your best self.
Yeah.
And no doubt, this process, if you are more introverted and just not as outgoing, it's a tough process to get through. And there was another way of hiring people, I think, awesome, because not everybody wants to go in, and the work may not entail being energetic and all that, but you do need to be that way in order to be appealing to the employer who's discerning and is trying to figure out who's going to be the best teammate for them.
For sure. I want to also build on a couple of other things that you said, and then maybe just some other quick interview tips as well. You mentioned the value of confidence in an interview. We talked about it a little bit. I think smiling, sitting up straight is one helpful way to build that confidence. But you also said, on the contrary, you can be overconfident. You can come off as arrogant. These are things to avoid, of course. Striking that balance, I think, is really challenging. I would say for most of the veterans that I speak with, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Most of the veterans that I speak with, what makes them such a great teammate is that they are humble. If you give me someone that's humble, then you can work with them. They're going to be, sometimes they're their own worst critic, and then they're constantly seeking these ways to improve themselves. All amazing values to have in a teammate. But the worst thing to do in an interview, like if you're constantly saying, I didn't accomplish anything, all these other people accomplished all these things. If I'm interviewing you, I'm like, all right, great. Can you put me in touch with those other people? I'd love to hire them.
Yeah, Brennan, in the Marine Corps, a good junior officer is passing on praise to his subordinates. Yeah. He's not grandstanding and taking and hogging all the glory.
Totally.
In the interview, you got to own your accomplishments and own your successes. And I've coached folks over the years, like an easy way to do that is to just talk about the hard work that went into what was being done, tell the story, and then that you reaped the success and rewards. It was all based on the hard work that you and the team that you were leading put into it. And generally it doesn't come across as cocky or arrogant or anything like that, or bragging.
Totally. Yeah, that is really good advice. I've not heard it phrased that way, but that's why you're the OG.
You
I think
learn
another
many things over the years, Brent.
totally. I think another piece of advice that I would give to folks in an interview, it's really tempting to talk at length, but I do think that most interview questions benefit from concision, from being really concise. And you can overdo this. I'll give you a funny example. When I interviewed at one of the business schools that I applied to and was unsuccessful in my applications, they asked me the most basic question. I prepped so much for this interview. It was obnoxious. They asked me like, oh yeah, tell me about yourself. I was like, I was born in Baltimore. I'm in the Marine Corps and that's what I've been doing. And it was like too concise. I was like,
Yeah.
and I heard myself say it. I was like, that was incredibly dumb. Like, why did you do that? It happens. But what about, yeah, mistakes happen and I make a lot of them. But can you tell me a little bit about the value of being concise and how you try and coach about or think about like how long should an interview response be? Like how do you cut it off and end an interview response? Curious to hear any thoughts that you have about the length of the response.
It depends on the question a little bit. If it's tell me 3 strengths, that's going to be a longer response. But you nailed it. The second biggest turnoff for interviewers after arrogance is loquaciousness. When you say, tell me about yourself, and it's a 30-minute interview, and at 20 minutes, the person is still going. And so clearly, probably nervous, probably didn't practice enough and prepare. But in general, like a tell me about yourself response, keep it to 2 or 3 minutes, hit the highlights, hit the successes, and then some of your why, and then everything else that gives them some things to delve into in the interview.
Totally. Yeah. And I feel one thing that I really encourage people to practice, or I like suggesting to people to practice, is ending their responses with a crisp ending. And you can always default back to this exact sentence. You can say, I'm happy to go into additional details if it's helpful, but I want to pause here and make sure that I am fully answering your question. Something like that, where it's just give them the opportunity to go deeper if they want, but also just give them the mic back. To your point, when people talk, when they're talking at you for 20 minutes, it's damn, man, I had this full list of questions that I had to get through, didn't get through any of them. And so unfortunately, no matter how much I like you, we can't move forward because I didn't even get through my questions. Right.
Definitely. And a lot of people will make that mistake. People who are highly educated, people who have done incredible things. Again, a lot of it goes back to preparation and nervousness. And then hitting on the STAR format that we touched on earlier, and that does lead to a nice, tight, concise response. So having some sort of framework on how you want to answer questions ahead of time, and then, like we said, putting in the prep is really, when I talk about prepping for an interview, obviously you want to know your company and delve into LinkedIn and find out the person who you're speaking with, a little bit about them, but it's really prepping about your story.
Yeah. I want to ask you actually a follow-on question about gathering intelligence, but the other, like on a company, how do you research, et cetera. But before I do that, I do want to provide one additional interview tip, which is for folks to slow down the way that they speak just a half a click. It doesn't have to, I think in our culture, people speak really quickly when they're excited, when they want to tell you something, right? It's
Or
natural.
nervous.
Or they're nervous, exactly.
Yeah.
But slowing it down, even just a half a step, like I'm doing right now, it makes it feel like there's more confidence. It makes it feel a little bit more deliberate. And it gives you a second to think about what you're going to say next so you can eliminate some of those filler words and just be a bit more deliberate.
100%. Yeah.
Hopefully Jim and I are not going to be like practicing on each other for the rest of the interview. Anyway, okay, so Jim, so you mentioned the value of gathering intel before you go into a conversation with an interviewer. You mentioned a couple of them in rapid fire, but would be curious to hear any best tips that you might have for how to go about that intel gathering. I feel like you are the dude to ask about this for a few different reasons, but how would you recommend folks gather intel before an interview?
On the surface, getting started, obviously the website, find the job online if you can find it, the job description, read through it, detailed, print it out. If you have a chance before you're even submitting a resume, if you're applying for it, tweak it to the job description. You have multiple versions of your resume. And then I would hit LinkedIn is a phenomenal resource. And so are other, just in general, social media outlets. I had a CHRO for a Fortune 500 doing podcasts. And so it was a powerful thing when one of the people he was interviewing said, hey, I listened to your podcast. I totally agree with this and that. It was awesome. So there's a lot out there at your fingertips. And then I would try to, if you are able to, without being too forward, or I don't know what the word would be, but just if you can find someone on the inside, generally speaking, a vet is a great first choice. Someone you went to school with, maybe someone you served in the same unit with different times. But especially if it's a friend who's working there, just touch bases with them and try to get information that you can get about the company and working there that is not necessarily online and out there for the full public. I mean, that it stands out in an interview. It shows enthusiastic interest in the opportunity, somebody who's done that ahead of time. And that makes a big difference. Companies, they want to be wanted and they want to know that you're interested in working there. And that's a great way to show, even before you've had a chance to speak with anyone, how interested you are.
For sure. Yeah, it's really good advice. I would just to build on what Jim said, when it comes to reading the job description, I feel like my brain like glazes over when I see a job description. So to me, they almost all look almost completely identical. But it is important to sit down and take a minute to just try and visualize, what are they getting at here? Who is going to be successful in this role? And really to just try and, again, go bullet by bullet, visualizing it, understanding what the company does and how they make money. Yeah, it seems pretty basic, but there's a lot of businesses out there that are great fits that you maybe never have heard of just because they're not consumer businesses. So you've never interacted with them.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. The podcast piece is a good one. I'll say Jim used this to great effect during our conversations. He went back and listened to some of the podcasts to see, how do these dudes think? How do they interact? What do they like? And then mentioned it during our calls with each other too. I think it's not weird to mention that you've done research on a company. If you've talked to someone at the company, you're not doing it in order to name drop, right? You're doing it because you want to understand what it's like to work there, but it's a good signal to an interviewer that you are interested. So you should mention those things.
Definitely.
You mentioned LinkedIn, of course, and then YouTube videos. If there's interviews with like CEOs or something like that, same thing as the podcast, right? It's just helpful kind of context. So strongly recommend go into your interviews prepping, do the intel work ahead of time so that when you get in the interview, you can mention, yeah, I talked to my buddy that works there. I listened to your podcast. I heard your CEO say in a speech the other day that XYZ is really important and that really resonated with me. Those things will set you apart.
Totally. And you got to remember, it goes back to the old Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. People are interested in people who are interested in them. So from the hiring manager hearing like, wow, you listened to our podcast, you did this, you did that, you're going to stand out think about the person who didn't do all of that and who they're speaking with.
Totally. Jim, I want to transition the conversation just a little bit and ask you, what do you think that candidates, so there's a couple ways to go about a job hunt. Of course, you can set up a bunch of interviews yourself. Hopefully you're reaching out to a bunch of folks to see what opportunities are available at their companies. We recommend that for absolutely everyone. You can also work with a recruiter on a job, like yourself, like our team. What do you think the candidates should know about working with a recruiter like you or like one of the members of our team when they're beginning to pursue a job through our company?
First and foremost, I would understand that if you're trying to be in one city and it's a restricted search, this is what we run into, I'd say, Brendan, all the time. We may not be a great resource. We're not a great resource for everyone. So if it is, and then if I have an opportunity in that city, then holy cow, Jim's incredible. Brendan, wow, they really took great care of me. But in general, most recruiting firms will have their clients, different roles popping up, different positions they're recruiting for. But if somebody needs to stay in a particular market and we don't have anything, then we're not going to be that great. The other thing is really, if you're contacting a recruiter about a specific position that might have been posted online or on the website, understand too that very few of the overall, like the requirements for the position are being posted. Only because there's only so much room on LinkedIn, so many character spaces and that kind of stuff, you can't put anything in there. So if you're not getting a lot of love or necessarily moving forward in the process, that's probably the main reason. Is just there's a lot of outlying requirements that just you're not hitting. And then keep the recruiter as one angle and one avenue for your search, but I would never put all your balls in that recruiter's court, which I know people do. And I know there are some firms out there that require that, which is, to me, it's just insanity. This is not 1999. There's a whole world out there at your fingertips. You can reach out to hiring managers directly, but just have managed expectations with you're working with a firm. And then when you are working with them, I would just say, be honest, be straightforward. Ideally, you're working with someone reputable, like a Brendan. Ideally, I'd like to think I am too, who will give you the straight and honest scoop the whole way through. And we expect the same. And if you're going with another role, no big deal. Just let us know. We also have client relationships with the hiring companies that we value a lot and want to take care of. And so we don't want anybody torching them, just completely ghosting or just bad behavior. So just be the professional you were in the military as you approach the job search and when you're engaging with a recruiting firm, and you will get nothing other than professional service in return.
Yeah, it's all really great advice, Jim. I would also dovetail and add on in terms of why you would think about working with a recruiter. It is a bit of inside access. Develop these relationships with clients and we're close to them. And we're hoping, our goal is that we are an extension of their hiring team. And as such, we are able to, when we go to bat for a candidate, we know that there's a high likelihood that employer is going to then be able to put them into an interview process. They're going to have trust in our word. And so it can give you a bit of inside access. It can give you a bit of flavor of what it's like at the company because we've done due diligence on the culture. And so we can provide you with some of that information in a lower threat environment than an interview, right? Where it's you're
Definitely
very much performing, right, for the person that you're trying to be working with.
And when we were talking about preparation just a moment ago, that is the recruiter's job, is to prepare you for the interview, to get you as fully ready to go in the first, second, third, all throughout the steps, keep you informed, debrief with the company, and be that go-between. But it's a powerful thing when it's like I've placed like at an aerospace and defense leadership development program for the last 6 years, put 40 people into that. I know who they're going to be speaking with. I know the questions that are going to be asked and can certainly help people get prepared for those interviews. Or like some of the private equity operator roles. For some of our clients, Brendan, between you and me, we've placed like 30, 35 guys in one holding company. We know the ins and outs. And oftentimes when the new candidate is doing interviews, they may be interviewing with one of the guys that we put into the firm. And so we certainly can give them some tips and help their performance.
For sure. Yeah, I would also add that, of course, recruiters are the way that we interact with clients, right? The companies that are hiring folks, they are our clients. We obviously care deeply about those relationships. And our job is to find them the best possible person for that role. And I just want to flag that, of course, for our audience that might be less familiar with some of the incentive structures that are in place around recruiting, that this is a role, it's a sales role, like you said. And so I do want to also flag that aspect of our work. Our number one core value as a business is to operate with empathy and to treat relationships as more important than revenue. But of course, I do think it's worth flagging. So if you're working with a recruiting company or with a recruiter, of course, just something to know in your head that, hey, it is also a sales role. You should, hopefully you're going to build a relationship of trust with that recruiter and their word is their bond, because trust is the only currency that we really have. But of course, it's also important to do due diligence. So I just wanted to highlight that and flag that as well.
Definitely.
Jim, you've seen a lot of resumes. Tell me about what advice do you have around crafting a compelling resume that is going to stand out from the pack?
I have. I've looked at a lot of resumes. The three things I look for and encourage people to do, and usually they don't start here. If they do, they usually borrowed their buddies who got out like a year before, and but everybody does a great job telling me on a resume what they were responsible for. Just like in the military, 1, 2, 3 did X, Y, and Z. They don't do a great job talking about the results of their work. And the resume needs to be results focused. And the results need to be quantified as best as you can, even if it is a estimate. This is not a court of law. You're not swearing in on a Bible. If you're trying to figure out, man, I know I did great at that school and I was top 10% or 15%, go in the middle, but put some data to your performance, to the things that you've done. That's the first and foremost. Then I would say, focus on your own individual performance and not just unit performance too. It's easy to talk about the we and all that. Again, you got to talk about what you did and what you accomplished on the resume in a little bit. And then think about things that you've done that were extraordinary and give those some context. Even if it is like a first time ever, adding those words into a sentence or built from scratch or however, but you just want to form the team under whatever the duration was, executed so many missions, 50% beyond what was executed in a similar period previously or something to that effect. But just think about the unique things that you were able to do and then just a little bit of context for the reader. And realize some of those readers, most will never have served in the military, so they may not get exactly what you're talking about. So the context, again, half a sentence can go a long way.
Yeah, this all excellent advice. I would also just add the resume is an iterative process. You're not going to have the final draft on your first draft. It's not. I think I went 25 drafts when I was getting out of the military. It's like obnoxious, but everybody's going to catch something a little bit different. So it's going to be iterative over time. I love what you said about don't tell me your billet responsibilities. Tell me your billet accomplishments. In the Marine Corps fit rep, those are separate sections. I don't know how the fit rep looked when you were in the Marine Corps. I assume it was on like stone tablets, like with a rock and chisel or something like that. But
papyrus by that point.
Okay, perfect. Even better. But yeah, billet responsibilities. It's, hey, I was assigned to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah, but what did you do? Did you do those things? Were you good at them? Did you put up good results? That's just so important. Results oriented is super, super important. Numbers really stand out in a resume. We're scanning it. Everybody tells you this, but I think it's difficult to really empathize with or like experience until you've done it on the other end of the table. But when I see a number, my eyes really, they just pause and it's okay. I see the number 3. Okay, what is this in relation to? Or I see the number 1, right? And this guy was the number 1 person at their unit. Wow, that's awesome. That should be the first bullet in every section, hopefully, if It's true. Yeah.
And if you see a pattern of that number 1 sort of thing, then it's okay. This is somebody I really want to take seriously from the employer's perspective. Last thing on writing resumes is it's not designed to tell your entire story. It's designed to be a snapshot of your work history, educational background, unique skills. So just keep that in mind. And I would strongly encourage you, depending on your level of experience, a page, if it's 5, 10 years, if it's more than that, 2 pages, but I would never go beyond 2 pages. And I do mean never, because no one will read anything beyond that. And I'd be even surprised now if people are reading much on page 2.
Totally. Yeah, that's really good advice. Be concise in your resume. I think the exception is like federal resumes. I don't know anything about federal resumes.
I don't either.
Yeah, we just really don't deal with them. Yeah. But yeah, if you're looking for advice on federal resumes, this is probably not the right podcast for you. But from the ones I've seen, they're like 10 or 20 pages or something like that. It's really wild stuff.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. My advice is really focused on private sector.
100%. Jim, I want to be sensitive of our time. For listeners, I promise we'll have Jim back on the show. I know that he's going to be a fan favorite, much more popular, I'm sure, than I am. He's also brighter and has been in the game for a lot longer, so he's got better advice for you. But we'll have Jim back on the show. Maybe we'll do like a segment in the future about what industries we're seeing hiring a bunch of vets, or like where the nature of some of these different types of roles that we post. That would be really awesome for us to be able to get there over time. But for today, for the conversation, any general advice that you would have for transitioning veterans or for folks that are kicking off a job search? I know we've given a bunch of advice, but is there anything else that you would want to add for folks to be thinking about as they're coming out of the military?
The biggest piece is this isn't a race. There's no blue ribbon at the end of the job search. Give yourself some grace and go easy on yourself. When you join the company you're joining, it's going to feel weird, and know that as big of a transition as going into the military was, moving back into the civilian world is just as giant.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to learn. There's going to be jargon and acronyms and all that. Leave your ego at the door. Find that mentor in your new company or a vet who you can talk with and bounce ideas against. And then when you make that commitment, if things start getting tough in 9 months or they just didn't work out the way you want, dig in a little bit and just I see so many people who leave so quickly, and I know every situation is different, and I try not to be judgmental at all, but when it's multiple moves like that, it does hurt
Totally.
their overall marketability and resume from the hiring manager. It's just they were only at the last three jobs for 12 to 18 months. How could they even get anything done and see the fruits of their labor during the beginning part? So just it's going to take time, and it's going to take time to get your footing, and just give yourself that time.
It's a really good flag. Spending more time in each individual role. If there's one drawback to folks coming straight out of the military, it's like we do tend to job hop a little bit until we can find the right thing. And as you get more senior in your career, that will be to your detriment. Spending time in a role for a number of years is really helpful, to your point.
It's one thing I'll also mention is for the listeners, if you are 35 years old, you've never experienced a recession. And so we have had nothing but 4% or less unemployment for as long as I can remember, 10 years probably, roughly. And so the job market's been hot. When we hit a recession, as we do from time to time, those people with that 1 year, who, when everyone is hiring and unemployment's super, super low, it's not as big of a deal. Corporate America will exact a pound of flesh out of that and not interview, not hire. And that's when it really, those decisions and choices,
For sure.
Hopefully we don't run into that anytime soon.
Jim, maybe we'll get you back on the podcast, talk about the Great Depression and what it was like to live through that. But before
PTSD.
Jim's going to pop through this camera and hit me in the face. Okay, before we do that, Jim, how can listeners learn more about our open roles, connect with our team? Do you prefer that people apply? Do you like them to send an email? Should people be reaching out to you on LinkedIn? What's your preferred avenue for someone to be able to get in touch with our team?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Follow us on LinkedIn, follow Brendan, follow me. We post some pretty awesome career roles every single week. We're out there. Sign up for our newsletter. Go to milvet.org, TheMilVet.org. You'll see resources tab. Click on the resources tab, and then you'll see a button where you can just pop in your email, and you'll get our newsletter, which isn't just about careers. It also talks about our live events all over the country, which is a fantastic way to build community and build your network and find a job.
Totally. Yeah. Jim, man, I really appreciate having you on the team. Appreciate being in the trenches next to you. And I appreciate you joining us on the podcast today. Thanks for joining us, Jim.
It's been my pleasure, Brendan. I've been listening to these for a long time, and I have to say, extremely enjoyed the time with you today. So thank you.
Awesome. You're a great American. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed the show today. Please do come back next week. We've got more fantastic guests coming up. We also have in-person events, to Jim's point. We've got them coming up in Philly, DC, New York City. We're going to have one in Park City for ski season. We're going to get out on the slopes, Jim. I promise.
I'm in.
Yeah, we got them in San Francisco for Veterans Day. Tim's doing one out there. I'm guessing we're going to get one added for Colorado at some point as Liz ramps. So we will have live events all across the country. We just wrapped up a huge Texas tour, which was a ton of fun. So check out themilvet.org/events to join us at one of those live events. We really hope to see you in person. Feel free to reach out anytime to me via email. You can do just brendan@themilvet.org if you've got feedback about the show. Jim, thanks for joining us today, and we'll catch you listeners back here next week.